and welcome to another live stream with Creative Science. This is our third one. For those of you who aren't familiar with Creative Science, we are an online magazine exploring marketing, sales, PR, and now tech. We are almost a year old, and if you like this, be sure to like the video, subscribe, and follow us on LinkedIn and Substack as well. My name is Luke Jones, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Creative Science. And let me introduce Sam, our deputy editor, and I'll pass it over to you, Sam.
Perfect. Thank you, Luke. So I've been at Creative Science for the last 9 months. It's given me the ability to promote certain types of content, really engage with different types of audiences, as well as learn about what's going on. And I think one person I came across that I think would be really interesting to learn more from would be Tom Goodwin. At this point, frankly, I think half of LinkedIn follows him, so I don't think he's a surprise or an unknown to anybody. But at this day, we're joined by Tom Goodwin, who is a business transformation consultant, a keynote speaker. He has a couple of pieces within the World Economic Forum as well. And I would say one of the more thoughtful voices in marketing and advertising. So he's known for his perspectives around data, technology, how brands are actually built over time, and helping companies rethink how they operate in a rapidly changing landscape. So please see Tom.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's go ahead and just dive into this. What are some of the biggest mistakes that you're seeing companies make right now in advertising?
I mean, broadly speaking, I think everyone's completely overwhelmed. I think the arrival of the internet was quite difficult for people because they had to kind of rethink how they worked and what advertising was all about. And then we had COVID, and now we've got AI. And I think everyone is so sort of overwhelmed by changes that matter, changes that don't matter. This sort of need to sort of do things for technology's sake to show that you get it. But I think a lot of people are really confused about what their job is and what their job isn't. In particular, I think the mistake that's being made, it's sort of twofold, really. One is there is a desire from all businesses to operate in a very short-term fashion, and one where everything is documented. So we're seeing more and more money move towards where it can make an immediate impact on a spreadsheet. And we're completely sort of losing faith in things that don't appear to immediately drive things that we can measure. That doesn't appear to be a problem yet because it's quite new. But I think most companies have become remarkably short-term and obsessed with numbers. And I think the second thing, and it's kind of related to that, companies have completely fallen out of love with their consumers. Marketing is an amazing job, and it means we get to live and breathe what normal people do. It means we get to go to shopping malls and look at how people behave. It means we get to watch films and see what the kind of cultural zeitgeist is. Like we have amazing jobs, and our jobs involve having a really innate and sort of instinctive sense of our customers, and what matters to them and what they're thinking about, and what's going to help persuade them. And I think we're doing our jobs at a moment in time where we're trying to understand consumers by looking at spreadsheets, and we're trying to look at data and evidence. And we've completely lost sight of what it is to be a person. It's extraordinarily difficult to buy a car these days. The ranging is a mess. The models are a mess. Dealerships are awful. Who in a car company is looking at the experience of buying a car and making it better? When you try and buy dishwasher tablets, do you want Finish Ultra Pro, or do you want Finish Platinum Plus, or do you want Ultimate Mega? When you try and buy a printer, there's 17 different types of printer that appear to be identical. When you try and buy toilet roll, there's this thing called toilet roll maths, where every package has, 3 equals 9 and 9 equals 12. We are making it unbelievably difficult for people to understand what we're offering. And I think the sort of mixture of this obsession with numbers, this drive for stuff that gets measured in spreadsheets, and a disregard for consumers means that people are essentially making the mistake of not doing the simple things that matter.
So just to kind of dig into that a little. Do you think that it's more of a focus on like, okay, what's the bottom of the funnel, who's ready to buy, and not building a relationship with like the person for the entire journey that they're going to take?
I mean, in very simple terms, advertising used to be above the line and below the line. And above the line was creating interest and seducing people and making people understand and like your product. And that was about 90% of marketing spend until about 10 years ago. And that means that someone like me knew that BMW was a really good car, aged 8. And it means that I dreamt about flying on Concorde on British Airways. It created this sort of desire that may take these companies 20 or 30 or 40 years to turn into a sale. More recently, the budgets are pretty much split, where 90% of money is now spent on performance marketing. And that makes a lot of sense for new types of company. If you're Uber and you're trying to get people to download your app, you don't need to build a brand so much as get people to download your app. If you're, Temu selling, cheap pillowcases, you just want to flog some pillowcases. You don't need a sort of long-term relationship. But I think what happened is companies that didn't necessarily have that much money were technology oriented, and they created this sort of performance playbook. And in the performance playbook, you do 3,000 ads and you see what works. In the performance playbook, you can calculate your return on ad spend immediately. In the performance playbook, everything you sell is sold online. And that works unbelievably well for those companies. So if I'm trying to sell an online course, digital performance marketing is amazing. If I'm trying to sell a water bottle that looks like a dinosaur on my website, dinosaurwaterbottles.com, it's amazing. If I'm trying to sell like fabric softener, or if I'm trying to sell a bank account, or if I'm trying to sell a new tariff, is actually a pretty terrible playbook for me to use. People are going to choose a mobile network because of big, wasteful, expensive advertising rather than performance marketing. But what's happened is, because the companies that were doing performance marketing were sort of sexy, and because they became unicorns, and because everyone talked about Harry's and people fell in love with Casper and everyone talked about Warby Parker, that became the sort of gold standard in advertising. And now basically what's happened is the larger companies who should use a little bit of performance advertising have now sort of fallen in love with everything that's performance. And at the same time, we've completely forgotten everything that actually worked really well for about 200 years. And we've completely kind of fallen in love with tracking how every dollar gets spent. We've fallen in love with tracking all the technology we use. We've fallen in love with attribution. We've fallen in love with measuring return on ad spend precisely. And it's now sort of impossible for people to do their jobs well, because if you put $1 into search, you can probably show that you make $8 back. And if you put $1 into, I don't know, sponsorship, you can't really show that it worked at all. I mean, people will do the maths and they'll show it's worth $2 or $3. And then you go to the CEO and they say, well, why don't you put all your money in search? Because this sponsorship seems to be 2 or 3 times less effective. So it's almost impossible to do the stuff that actually we know in our hearts works, because we've kind of fallen in love with stuff that's very immediate, that's close to the point of purchase, and has a sort of robust defendability to it.
That's really interesting, because it seems like a lot of the data we have data upon data upon data. We track everything about each person's actions, what they're seeing, what they're reading. We have, like you said, spreadsheets upon spreadsheets, but people feel more unseen than ever. I think especially from the marketing and advertising side, even just speaking anecdotally, I'm on YouTube, I'm getting ads that don't apply to me. Everything is performance-based. Buy this now. And every screen is like, buy this now. So if modern best practices like constant optimization, A/B testing, launching, like you said, 3,000 ads, seeing what works, focusing on the one that does, which might be just a coincidence, if that is fundamentally flawed, what have we misunderstood about how advertising actually works?
I mean, my personal opinion is that approach is not flawed. I think it's that people are mistaking what can be shown in a spreadsheet to work with actually whether or not it worked. So if I have spent years dreaming about an Aston Martin, and then I go to Facebook and I type in Aston Martin, I'll get served ads for Porsche, Ferrari, every single luxury car, and every single car that's not luxury will then be in my way. And if I happen to then go and buy a Kia, that team that placed the Kia ads, which probably made zero difference to my decision to buy a Kia, will get almost all of the credit. I mean, it depends on the attribution techniques they use, but like, it's either going to get a lot of credit or all of the credit. And that's just nonsense. So advertising has become this sort of trickery where companies are trying to insert themselves into people who are most likely to buy, and then they're sort of claiming success for that. And again, depending on what you're doing, that may well be a great thing to do. It may well be a useful thing to do. It may be completely misleading. And I think the problem that we have at the moment is people are falling in love with tactics that are perhaps inappropriate for their situation. And they're being kind of tricked by technology, which is more about being able to claim success than it is about being able to kind of create success. So I think, generally speaking, a lot of people are doing slightly the wrong things and then slightly misunderstanding how it works. And at the same time, a lot of the stuff which definitely still works, but in ways that we can't prove, is not being done. So what's the return on investment for a tagline? I don't know, but I also know that, we try harder for Avis is something that actually has made me download their app. I know that there are beers that when I go to the tap and I'm a little bit confused, I'll remember, Castlemaine Forex because of ads that I saw in literally 1986. So we've sort of forgotten how advertising actually works. And I think there's this really fascinating dilemma, actually, where I think about half of the people in advertising think they understand how advertising works and they're wrong. And without being rude, this is the sort of performance playbook where they think that by putting a pixel in front of me, that they've made me choose to fly on Qantas rather than the fact that, I've always flown on Qantas. And then I think half of the world of advertising knows that they don't understand how advertising works. But that's not a very helpful thing right now. I'm a kind of unusual because I have the confidence to sit in the meeting and going, what, we don't really understand how advertising works. If San Pellegrino do a brand campaign, it doesn't immediately make people go and buy San Pellegrino water, but it means that restaurants are more likely to take it. It means that it's easier to get points of distribution in retail because you go in with a little folder with Perspex leaflets saying, we're going to spend $10 million above the line. And then the buyer goes, okay, we'll give you one more listing. It means that people who work for Nestle Waters feel a bit more proud of the fact that they get to work on brands whose work gets seen by people. So advertising works in millions and millions of different ways, and it's a very sort of weak but long-lasting force. And a fascinating thing I think to do is to look around your house. Why do we own the things that we do? Why do I have a Parker pen next to me? Why did I buy these glasses I don't use from Warby Parker? What made me choose the Samsung TV? Why did I get a Lucid and then not end up renewing the lease, even though it was the best car I've ever owned? Why do I bank with Chase? Like, you can't really sort of explain these things, and people that think it wasn't advertising are quite often wrong.
Going off of that, just kind of a follow-up is you're talking about attribution in there, and if I saw a billboard, right, there's not going to be a direct attribution to my purchase, obviously. Nobody knows that I saw that billboard and then made that purchase. Do you think that ad tech companies have created this narrative where, okay, we do know what the last thing was per that UTM, leading to that form fill? Do you think there's been a false narrative created around how advertising works in that respect?
Yeah, I'm going to be a bit controversial, maybe for the sake of it, but the internet happened, and advertisers and marketers were very, very, very slow to understand it, and they felt massively behind, and they were never curious enough about it to understand it. And then when it became a big thing, there was this huge sense in the industry that we'd sort of fucked up, and that we hadn't fallen in love with it enough and we hadn't used it enough. And then at this point, the tech companies all had massive scale and they had all the yachts at Cannes and they paid vast amounts of money to people all over the industry to promote them. And what happened is clients and people in the industry became paranoid that they didn't know enough. And they became paranoid that their language was fluffy. And they basically got sold on this. It's not a myth. It's just a simplification. They got sold on the idea that you can measure return on ad spend in real time. They got sold on the idea that click-through rates matter for every category. They got sold on this idea that you can use AI to look at a TV ad and it can tell you which part of the ad is most compelling. They got sold on this idea that you can digest human behavior at a kind of synapse level and then make ads that are better. So the sort of whole industry basically got sold on sophistication, and it got sold on technology, and it got sold on customer data platforms, and it got sold on context targeting, and it got sold on audience buying, and it got sold on retargeting, and it got sold on Qualtrics and fucking NPS. It got sold on so much stuff which is sort of directionally helpful, but basically it's not a lie. It's just way worse and way less helpful than people think. But because everyone sort of got sold by these companies and they had so much money, you look like a real chump if you're the person saying like, oh, we just need to make a good TV ad, or oh, we just need to take photographs of our luggage and then make it look beautiful and then pull it in like the Delta Airlines magazine. Like, you were made to look like an idiot if you weren't doing the very most sophisticated thing. And I think technology companies did an amazing job of selling us on the stuff that they were selling. And the fact that click-through rates have been shown by 13 studies to be completely meaningless is almost of no consequence to anyone in the industry. They're still going to spend, 1% of media spend on a technology that increases conversion through click-through rates. It's really weird to me, and I'm kind of one of the few people that I think understands enough about both sides of the picture to be able to ask these questions. And I realized that actually, the likes of Meta and Snapchat and TikTok and LinkedIn and Google, they've got so much money that there's not really that much to gain by speaking out against it, because it just means that your consulting budgets will not end up in your pockets. And it means that if you need to get a job later on, it won't be easy. And it means you won't get invited to the biggest parties that can. So I'm not some sort of like, rogue element that's speaking out against the mafia. I'm just saying it's all a little bit more complicated than perhaps it appears.
What's really interesting about that is that it seems like most advertisers or just companies as a whole seem to copy everyone else, as opposed to, from what I understand about marketing, is it's valuable to stand out, to be unique, to be distinctive. But it seems like everyone is just everyone else. There's no one that really stands out. Like in your toilet paper example, it's like 9 rolls is 12, 12 is 21. It's like, what's going on, and what's the value of standing out and being unique?
I think the problem is you have to look at sort of people's motivations for doing their job. And at the end of the day, if you're a large company CMO, your life is generally better if you make fairly safe, logical, sophisticated data supported arguments. So if you have this sort of metaphorical meeting to talk about your website, and you said that you got McKinsey in and they gave you some best practices, and now it looks identical to your nearest competitors, that looks like quite a clever way to do your job. If you decide to sort of emulate everything that Amazon did, you get to stand up in a meeting, and if anyone calls you out, you say, oh, is Jeff Bezos wrong? You're telling me that maybe the richest man in the world tomorrow is wrong, and better. So you look like a real idiot if you do things differently. And it's not that people should be doing things differently for the sake of it. It's not that you should decide to sort of go about things differently. But I think there's, you're reducing the chance of something amazing happening. If you pre-test your ads and then choose the one that everyone liked, then you're reducing the chance of doing something like Red Bull have done, or you're reducing the chance of doing something like Apple did, or you're reducing the chance of, becoming infamous like Allspice or Budweiser. And we're kind of weird because as an industry, we kind of celebrate the rogue people and we celebrate creativity and we celebrate courage and we celebrate the ads that sort of push the envelope. And then we go back into a meeting room and we say, you know, what do you think? And we sort of hide a little bit. And that's not me being critical. It's just, you know, that's what happens when the people who are senior have kids in private school and they're terrified to lose healthcare. So.
What would you say then, given all that, to like the CEO who asks you, he says, you know, I've got a limited amount of money to spend. We want to get clients, you know, end of the day. That's why we're spending. I want to know where our clients are coming from. Is that a misguided way to think about all this? How do you educate?
So this is where, you know, 90% of people listening to this will just sort of raise their eyebrows and sort of tut and, you know, stop watching. I by being in this industry, it's our job to understand people. It's our job to just trust our feelings and our judgment. And I think it's the best way to do our jobs is just to go out for a bit of a walk and observe and read stuff and look at the comment section in the Daily Mail and go to Chinese cities and look at what people are doing on phones and ask their niece and nephew how they spend their time and ask their grandparents how they spend their time. It's our job to just sort of build up an innate picture of what's going on. And then based on that, think, you know, one, is this product or service actually good enough to exist? You know, I think marketing becomes very expensive when we're trying to get people to buy something that doesn't need to exist. Two, you know, what is the most compelling thing about our product or service? Again, remarkably little advertising actually says anything that's particularly helpful. Three, like, how do we convey that point of difference? You know, is it about ease? Is it about sexiness? Is it about history? Is it about provenance? Is it a founder's story? And then figure out really simple ways to tell that story. And again, I get kind of confused because I think, you know, if you make golf equipment, you know, maybe you could just put your ads like in pro shops and you could put your ads in in-flight magazines because that's quite premium. Or maybe you can put your ads on the Golf Channel, and maybe you can put your ads, maybe you can use a bit of a pixel. That means that when someone goes to golf.com, you follow them around a little bit and you do behavioral targeting. But I don't think it needs to be that much more complicated than that. And we've sort of fallen in love with this sophistication, you know, this idea that if it's you know, because trust me, I've been in these meetings and I've come up with these ideas and I've said it's a good idea. And now sort of 11 years on, I realize that I'm wrong. You know, I was there saying there's this first day in March in New York where everyone suddenly takes off all their clothes and they sit in a park and they remember what the sun feels like. And it's a real insight. And I was like, why don't we use that moment and place ads for convertible cars? Because this is going to be a day when everyone suddenly thinks about buying a convertible car. And you can do that. You could do that in 2016, and it was very sophisticated. And it achieved absolutely nothing. You know, you spent 20% more money on data and tech, and then you got like a 1% uplift in click-through rates, which didn't even matter anyway, because we've already discussed click-through rates don't mean anything. But I think we're so sort of obsessed with doing things that are magically sophisticated. We don't just do the really simple things. Like, why don't we have a jingle in our ad? Why don't we give someone something to remember? You know, why don't we make sure that when you click on why don't we make sure that when you click on the ad for the TV, we take you through to the landing page for that TV, you know, rather than to some broken link or, you know, actually a link for a different product. You know, why don't we call our TV something that people can remember so they can see why it's better than the other one? You know, I think we've fallen in love with complexity.
To pivot to AI quickly, you talk about in one of your more viral posts on LinkedIn, I think it was last month, you talk about AI as augmentation, but not replacement. What does that mean exactly?
I'm a little bit scared because everyone who seems to be most enthusiastic about AI seems to be sort of getting, you know, genuinely almost sexually excited about the idea of firing people and cutting costs. You know, how can we get all of our call center agents and not give them money and not employ them and then let a chatbot do it instead? You know, I profoundly believe that there's more money to be made by doing things better and by doing more. I mean, in this particular case, actually, IKEA had a great example where they took their call center workers, and after making their systems more efficient, they retrained them to be interior designers and kitchen planners. And then they made billions, literally billions of dollars from this new service. So I think the role of us is not to be sort of job creators, by design, but it's to recognize that people are amazing. And the new technology means that people can accomplish more. So when we should be looking at these systems, we shouldn't be thinking, how can AI do our jobs? We should be thinking, how can AI do somewhat of our jobs a little bit automatically, that then frees us up to spend our time doing stuff which is far more valuable. And if that's not enough, then how do we start doing extra stuff that we didn't even dream about doing before? So why don't we do the best customer service that's ever existed? Why don't we sort of engage with people in ways where we're selling them stuff that we didn't make before, because now we can make it more easily? How can we look at every part of the process, and because of all this new technology, do stuff that's profoundly different and better in a way where customer service isn't thought about as a cost center. It's thought about as a genuine point of difference.
Yeah, I really like that. Do you feel that AI has like kind of held people back in a way? Are people really leveraging it in a way that makes sense, where it's driven by curiosity, it's driven by really the opportunities that are there for it, rather than just saying, okay, well, can it just eliminate this person's work?
I think the really amazing thing about AI is that people have very different attitudes towards it. And I've been really wonderfully surprised by how a fairly large number of people who I didn't necessarily expect to have got really stuck into it. So there are people who you would imagine would be quite late to embrace technology that have really, learned how to get involved with it, and they've learned what it can do and what it can't do. And they've had this really amazing attitude towards doing much, much more. At the same time, I mean, you can almost do like a sort of matrix where, one will find that there is everything from people that are kind of in denial and deliberately not using it. There are people who are using it, but they're using it with a very negative attitude, and they're sort of enjoying being cynical about it, and how, it can't count the R's in strawberry, and it will tell you to leave your car at home if you want to get it washed in a local car wash. And, there are people really sort of hamming up the moment it fails. And then there are people who do the opposite, that are saying it's going to change everything, and that every plumber is going to be, put out of work by a robot. And what you see is a sort of spectrum of people in all directions. And I think I guess this is advice. I think everyone needs to have a good attitude towards it. Everyone needs to be as optimistic as they can be, and everyone should be learning how to use it and curious about it and experimenting with it. And they should be using it to sort of figure out how they can do different stuff and stuff that's a bit better. And they should also be using it to figure out when it's not very good as well, because there's not enough information out there on the non-obvious times when it's not good. Like it's obviously bad at being a kitchen timer, and that's obvious. It's obviously bad at it telling you, what you're going to do later on that day, because how would it know? But it's also bad at doing things that you expect it to be good at. And it's areas like that I think people should spend more time.
So what's really interesting based off of that, obviously, I think I'm one of the people that think AI is going to change everything. And what I would say right now is the students in college right now are going to be entering a world that's going to look very different than the world I entered post-grad. What would you recommend a college student that's graduating maybe next month to learn more about, or to study more about, to get more comfortable with the new world order of AI?
It's a very good question. I mean, the reality is that no one actually knows how the world's going to be in 20 years' time, and no one knows how it's going to be in 5 years' time. I'm definitely not someone that subscribes to the idea that it's all a fad and it's going to go away, and computing power is too expensive, and it's a bubble. I also don't think it's going to change everything immediately because technology always takes a really, really long time. After I do this call, I have to go and get a document notarized again. And that means that someone's going to put some ink on a bit of paper. And then that's going to show that I was there. Like, how does ink on a piece of paper show that I'm there? And I would imagine that notaries probably were invented in like 1732 or something. But this is like how the real world works. Like the real world works on physical mail. The real world works on HIPAA regulations. The real world works on, prove you're not a computer by doing something a computer can do really fucking easily. It's the world's kind of sophisticated and stupid at the same time. So I don't think we can predict how the world will be, but I think it will change quite a lot, quite slowly in all directions. I think human nature doesn't change. And therefore, a lot of the principles and the values of education, I think, that are important today will continue to be important. But I do think we need to sort of focus on what makes us the most human we can be. And I think we need to reduce the time that we spend doing stuff which is the most robotic. So, if you're doing a degree in law, it's quite a nice example. You should be thoughtful about where the real value of a lawyer will come from, which will be, how do you build relationships with people? How do you persuade clients? How do you form a consensus with people? How do you look at the law in a creative way? How do you sort of solve problems in a different way? So it'll be less time sort of learning how to remember stuff, and there'll be much more time sort of problem solving. Architecture is quite similar. I don't think machines are going to be designing buildings, but they're going to be automating, the calculations for I-beams, and they're going to be automating, HVAC insulation rate calculations. But then your job becomes, okay, so, it's going to be more interesting for me to learn about new materials and see what innovation is going on. It's going to be better for me to understand the permitting process and build relationships with the permit staff. So I think every job has its own sort of unique trajectory. And I think it's going to be much more about fostering like empathy in people, presentation skills, sales skills, the ability to sort of what's it called? Sort of robust through change. And even then, like, there are sometimes that people like me say stuff like this on a call, and it just seems like the stuff that everyone's saying, like, oh, we need to be more creative. And then next month, someone will be like, oh, actually, AI is creative, so we don't need to be creative anymore. We're all figuring it out. But I think what is absolutely required is that if you have a sense of agility and you learn to enjoy change and you're curious, then I think you're going to be in a great position. But it's that curiosity and it's that comfort with change and uncertainty, which I think is going to be a key driver of success.
Excellent. And that brings us to a close. Tom, thank you for joining us. This was really a cool conversation. I very much enjoyed it.
It was good fun. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Tom.
All right. See you later, everyone.
Bye.